On March 13th, 1964, a woman named Kitty Genovese was stabbed to death outside her apartment in Queens, New York. The attack lasted over half an hour, and according to the New York Times, 38 of her neighbors watched from their windows and did nothing. No one called the police, no one intervened. They just watched. That story spread everywhere. It became the founding case study for one of psychology's most famous concepts, the bystander effect. It appeared in textbooks for decades. It launched entire research programs. It changed how psychologists thought about human nature. There's just one problem. Most of it wasn't true. We'll come back to that. First, let's talk about what the bystander effect actually is, because the real phenomenon is genuinely interesting, and more complicated than the version most people know. Two psychologists, John Darley and Bib Latani, were so disturbed by the Genovese story that they designed an experiment to understand what had happened. Their hypothesis wasn't that New Yorkers were cruel or indifferent. They thought something more specific was going on. Here's how the experiment worked. A participant sits in a room, supposedly about to have a conversation with other students over an intercom. Some participants are told they're the only other person in the conversation. Others are told there are 2 more people. Others are told there are 5. Then, through the intercom, one of the students, actually a recording, starts having what sounds like a seizure. When participants thought they were the only other person on the line, 85% of them got up and went to get help, almost immediately. When they thought there were 5 other people listening, that number dropped to 31%. Same situation, same sounds. Same person in distress. The only thing that changed was how many people the participant believed were also hearing it. Darley and Latani called this diffusion of responsibility. The more people present in an emergency, the less any single person feels like the help is specifically their job. It doesn't feel like apathy from the inside. It feels like reasonableness. Surely someone else is handling this, someone more qualified, someone who isn't in the middle of something. There's another force at work alongside diffusion of responsibility, and it's subtler. Imagine you're walking down the street and you see a man lying on the sidewalk. Is he having a medical emergency, or did he just sit down? You glance at him. You glance at the other people walking by. They're not stopping. They're not even slowing down. So you keep walking too. What just happened is called pluralistic ignorance. Everyone in that situation is uncertain. Everyone is looking at everyone else for cues about how to interpret what they're seeing, and because everyone sees everyone else acting calm, everyone concludes it must not be an emergency. The group's composure becomes its own kind of misinformation. The terrible irony is that the larger the crowd, the stronger this effect gets. More bystanders means more people acting calm, which means more evidence that nothing is wrong, which means even less likelihood that anyone acts. These two mechanisms, diffusion of responsibility and pluralistic ignorance, compound each other. You're not sure if this is an emergency, and even if it is, you're not sure it's your job to do something about it. In a crowd of strangers, both of those uncertainties push in the same direction. So given all of that, the story makes psychological sense. Except, again, the story wasn't accurate. In 2007, a researcher named Rachel Manning went back to the original case. She tracked down the actual police reports, the witness interviews, the court records. What she found was that the 38 witness claim had essentially been invented. The New York Times reporter had been told that number by the police commissioner during a lunch meeting, with no verification. The actual investigation found a handful of people who heard something, most of whom assumed it was a domestic dispute or a bar fight. One woman did call the police. A neighbor held Genovese as she died. The attack happened in 2 stages, in different locations. Most people who heard anything heard only part of it, with no way to understand what was happening. This doesn't mean nothing went wrong that night. Genovese was killed, and the response was inadequate. But 38 cold, silent witnesses watching a woman die over 30 minutes? That didn't happen. Here's why this matters. Darley and Latani's research is solid. The bystander effect is real and well documented across hundreds of subsequent studies. But it got attached to a story that was essentially myth, and that myth shaped how the concept was taught and understood for 40 years. The actual lesson got distorted. The Genovese story made the bystander effect seem like evidence that people are fundamentally selfish or cowardly under pressure. That framing stuck. The real finding, that it's a predictable, situational response to ambiguity and diffused responsibility, is more accurate and more useful, because if it's situational, it can be disrupted. Researchers have spent decades figuring out what actually gets people to act. A few things consistently work. Specificity is the biggest one. In an emergency, asking a crowd for help is almost useless. Asking one specific person, you, in the red jacket, call 911, bypasses diffusion of responsibility almost entirely. That person can no longer assume someone else is handling it. The responsibility is named and landed. Studies consistently show that specific requests produce dramatically higher response rates than general ones. Clarity of need matters almost as much. The pluralistic ignorance effect depends on ambiguity. When there's no question that something is wrong, someone collapses and doesn't get up, someone screams a specific threat. Bystander inhibition drops significantly. The clearer the emergency, the more likely people are to act. There's also evidence that simply knowing about the bystander effect makes people slightly more resistant to it. Not immune, but more likely to pause and ask whether their inaction is genuine assessment or just social contagion. Whether that knowledge holds up under the pressure of a real situation is harder to test for obvious reasons. Prior connection to the person in need helps too, though that one's almost circular. It's not a practical intervention so much as an explanation for why the effect is weaker in tight-knit communities than in cities full of strangers. The popular version of the bystander effect is a story about human selfishness. It gets cited as proof that people are fundamentally disengaged from each other, especially in cities, especially around strangers. The actual research tells a different story. The bystander effect is strongest when situations are ambiguous and responsibility is unclear. It's weakest when both of those things are addressed. People aren't choosing not to help. They're paralyzed by uncertainty, and the crowd makes that uncertainty worse. Darley and Latani didn't set out to indict human nature. They set out to explain a mechanism. The mechanism turned out to be about context, not character. Kitty Genovese's actual death was a tragedy. The fictional version of her death, the 38 silent witnesses, the half hour of deliberate inaction, became a different kind of tragedy. A story so psychologically satisfying that it crowded out the more complicated truth for 40 years. The uncomfortable part of the real research isn't that people are selfish. It's that being good isn't enough on its own. Situations shape behavior in ways that good intentions don't automatically override. Understanding the mechanism is how you get around it. And the mechanism, at least, we understand pretty well.